Thank you, my good friend Daniel, and hello, everybody. For those who don't know, my name is Nabeel. I am a registered social worker and also a community development specialist at the town of Oakville. This is our third week of programming, and we've talked so far about self-awareness. Just a very quick recap, the ability to understand how we are experiencing the world around us. There is objective self-awareness, and then there's the subjective self-awareness. The objective self-awareness often relates to the expectations that we ourselves have of ourselves based on perhaps societal expectations, parental expectations, spousal expectations, institutional expectations. And sometimes what we lose is what we actually want to do. And so with the objective self-awareness, we just to recognize the pressure that society puts on you versus what it is that you yourself want to accomplish. Secondly, I just want to very quickly also point out with subjective awareness is how you yourself are seeing the world, which means that it's all the internal mechanisms that we have available to us and all the wonderful things that we have control within our sphere. So that was our first week. The second week, we talked a little bit about stress management, and that stress really is an opportunity for us to respond to the things that we see around us. We can choose how we respond to those things. And, carrying on from that, today we're going to talk a little bit about strength and resilience. But before we get there, very quickly, I want to highlight what this program is and what this program is not. So this program is psychoeducational in nature, which means that we provide content, and through interaction, conversation, and personal reflection, the participants of this program figure out how this is contextualized into their personal lives. This program is not meant to be crisis intervention, counseling, or group support. However, those are very important things. And if you happen to be somebody in need of those services, I suggest just putting up some numbers here in case that is, we are experiencing crisis, which is a very real thing, especially during COVID-19. So, you can please contact 911, go to your nearest emergency center. And here are just some numbers available for you guys to contact. These numbers are available 24/7 and they're free of charge. So just give you a second to put that information in there. We're going to be together for the next 30 to 35 minutes. And so we're going to make this quite interactive. And as always, I like to start with a quote. So the quote for today, which is the topic for our discussion, is strength and resilience. First of all, when we're talking about mental wellness, I suppose it's hard to talk about our wellness without our strengths. And it's hard to talk about our resilience without the challenges that we experience in life. So this is just a quote. I'm going to read it to you guys, let it simmer, and maybe we'll ask some participants and some individuals what they think of it, right? So the quote is, do not let what you cannot do interfere with what you can do. I'm going to reach out to some of my friends here. Daniel, when you read this, what were your first reaction to this?
Yeah, so I can speak to this at least from, I'm at work, so I'll speak to it in my personal, professional lens. There are many things in my role that I would love to do for the Oakville community. There are many ambitions I may have. However, I'm restricted from, ensuring that I'm sticking to, the mandate of our Recreation and Culture Department within the budget that the ratepayers set out through their elected officials. Like, I try not to focus on that because in my position, there is still a lot I can do. Like this program, for example, this is a great way to connect with, residents about something that's really pressing right now, mental wellness. If I were to focus on mental wellness as a whole, that is not something I can resolve for residents of Oakville, but I can look at my, the mechanisms I have access to, and this is just a start, but it's something I can do.
Yeah, and really well put, Daniel. So there's this notion that we can sometimes feel restricted. We can sometimes feel limited. And when we feel restricted, we often have to ask ourselves, well, what does that lead us to? What thoughts comes to our mind when we feel restricted versus what thoughts come to our mind when we understand our capacities, right? So really interesting. I'm going to pass this on to Tanya. And Tanya, any kind of feedback, reflections on this particular quote. You're on mute, Tanya.
Okay, can you hear me now? So I'm not going to go really deep with this. I was just thinking about when I started to think about physical fitness because I'm not very active, but I decided that I needed to start to engage in some activity that I felt pressure that I had to be really good at working out or, being in a class with other people. I couldn't keep up with everyone. And so I had to stop thinking that way and really think about today I can do, so many sit-ups, and next time I come maybe I can add another one, and maybe I can grow from that place, and I don't have to feel like I have to do 10 sit-ups in the class because everybody else is doing it. So I think for me it's about breaking things down into stepping stones, so that I feel better about my own accomplishments than the end goal or what everybody else is doing because they've been doing it for longer, let's say.
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. And isn't that so interesting that we oftentimes look at what we should be doing based on what others are doing, right? And sometimes it takes away from what it is that we have the capacity to do. What is it that we can celebrate doing ourselves? So you're absolutely right, Tony. I really appreciate feedback. And if anybody else has any feedback, feel free to use the chat if there's any reflection that you have, or just unmute yourself and share away. We are an open platform for sure. This, leads me to this question. In moments of distress, what is our narrative? What is the story that we tell ourselves? And I'm going to give you a quick example of something that happened to me coming into work today. I woke up a little bit later than I should have. And on my way to work, as I'm entering the highway, there's an individual who decides to not let me from the merging lane. And I'm just thinking that what is this person's problem? Like, does he or do they not know that I'm trying to get to work, that I'm just trying to make a living, that for whatever reason that they don't want to let me into a merging lane? Like, there is something seriously wrong with this person. Why is this happening to me? And then I thought to myself, wait, what am I presenting today? I'm talking about strength and resilience. And I thought to myself, is that the narrative that I need to share? Is that the narrative that is true? And if I hold on to that story, what's the purpose? What's next steps for me? Will I feel empowered or will I feel discouraged? And it really got me thinking, because it was, sometimes even when we share within these platforms, the activities, interactions of day-to-day life can sometimes feel overwhelming. Something as simple as merging into a lane. I can imagine every other type of challenges that all of us might be experiencing, and the distress that we might be experiencing as well. But what's our story? What's the narrative that we're telling ourselves? If anybody feels like sharing, please feel free to use the chat box, or feel free to unmute yourself and share away. But perhaps I'm going to lead to my good friend Daniel here.
Yeah, when you pulled that slide up, I was thinking about myself, and I think that the role that I often find that I take in distress is that of like a fixer. I'm sure like young people I know, that's something that gets me into trouble all the time, is like I think that every challenge is just requires an immediate solution. I do it with my wife, my child, my job. Everything is, oh, I want to be the person that fixes everything. And that's not always required, especially in circumstances where you're not the appropriate person to be fixing, or the person just needs you to listen. So that's certainly something that I find that as I'm getting older now, I'm starting to realize that not every problem needs to be fixed.
Yeah. Wow. It's very insightful of you. I did not expect that, Daniel. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing.
Love to surprise you.
Yeah, yeah. I think what you said is so profound, because if you just think about it for a second, you mentioned not every problem needs fixing. Perhaps certain situations need accepting. And, we need to, the human desire is to solve problems in our lives. And I think that's fantastic. And, when we're going to talk a little bit more about the strength-based approach, I just want to highlight that the strength-based approach to dealing with any kind of our, mental wellness, any kind of stress that we experience in life is never to negate the emotional experience of the individual. There's a misconception that if I'm talking about my strengths, that I'm not actually acknowledging my emotional state, which might be vulnerable, which might actually be distressed. In fact, the strength-based approach is the idea that the story that I'm sharing, the story that I'm telling myself is so much more than the emotional experience. It's the validation of the emotional experience and the recognition of the strengths that we already have and that we will need to overcome that distress, right? So what we're going to talk about today is the strengths that we hold on to, the strengths that we have, but oftentimes it's not the story that we tell ourselves, or it's not part of the story that we tell ourselves. So when we feel distressed and we're not highlighting the good qualities, the strengths that we have, then just ask ourselves, what are we left with? We're left with the challenges. We're left with the weaknesses. We're left with things we have no control over. And try solving a problem from that lens. And so the strength-based approach really is the acknowledgement that we're vulnerable, is the acknowledgement that we're in distress. And it's by no means to take that away. It's to identify what can we do? What do we have to address it? So as we go on to the next slide, I want to think of, I want you guys to think of it as a struggle perspective. The reality of life is that at some point or another, we're going to struggle. We're going to struggle perhaps with things in life that are really overwhelming, that are really strong. Many of us are struggling right now with COVID-19. But there is a struggle perspective, that every struggle comes from a particular lens. And no two people seeing the same thing might have the exact same experience. So there's a struggle perspective that is based on a strength mindset, and there's a struggle perspective that's based on a deficit mindset. And I don't particularly like the word deficit, but the differentiation here is that when we concentrate on deficit, when we look at the distress that we're experiencing, when we look at our environmental realities, a deficit looks at what we don't have versus strength that looks at what we do have. And if you think about it for a second, if our attention is on all the things that we don't have, on all the things that we want, but we cannot access, then does that make us feel empowered? Does that take us one step closer to achieving that what we do want? Or does that push us a couple of steps backwards? Again, deficit mindset is not the same as acknowledging our emotional distress. In fact, through the emotional distress, we can identify our strengths. It's just a matter of what we're paying attention to. So the strength-based perspective really is the identification that we want to be solution-focused rather than the challenges that we're experiencing in life. We want to see ourselves primarily in terms of our strengths and not our weaknesses, because we are so much more than our weaknesses. We are so much more than the challenges that we experience in life. And how do we do that? We need to identify our strengths. We need to identify our talents. And we need to identify the skill sets that we have. That even in the distress that we experience, even in the realities of our lives where we feel completely helpless, that there's a level of resilience that we have to manage it, to cope with it, to deal with it, to feel burdened by it. We have strengths. We just have to acknowledge it. And so the strength-based mindset is the ability to retell our stories from a position of strength, even when we feel emotionally vulnerable. How do we do that? How do we define our strengths? This is just a few ways that I want you guys to think about how we go about defining our strengths, right? So what I want you to think of your strengths, think of things as what are you good at? What are you proud of? What can you do? How are you managing? What are you doing well? The answers to these questions contains so much of your strength, so much of your skills, so much of your talent. But oftentimes when we define strength, they all become convoluted when we don't know how we are defining certain strengths that we have within ourselves, right? So I've just broken down certain factors that impact the identification of our strengths. Intrapersonal, it's the conversations that we have with ourselves. Am I good enough? Boy, I'm really good at soccer, but I'm not good at basketball. It's the conversations we have with ourselves. I can do this. I have the skill set. I can't do this at all. I'm scared, right? It's the internal dialogue that we have within ourselves, right? So sometimes we have strengths that lay dormant because we've never had the opportunity to have a positive conversation with ourselves to identify that strength that we have. And sometimes we've had fantastic conversations with ourselves to identify the strengths that we have. So we have it even within ourselves to identify our strengths. Sometimes strengths are culturally based, which means that what might be considered a strength in one culture might not necessarily be considered a strength in another culture. If you just think of the workplace, what might be considered a strength in a workplace that requires you to come in 9 to 5, that's an office environment, and what considered to be a strength if you work much more with your hands, maybe in a place where you're fixing things. What are your strengths in those two situations? So even workplace is relevant to how we're defining our strengths. Now, sometimes what happens is we have all these fantastic strengths, but we're viewing the strengths from a very different perspective that masks them completely. And so all these factors impacts how resilient and strong do we actually know that we are. Certain strengths are contextual, meaning that in certain contexts, the strengths can be really identified and brought to light. Think of, contextual factors like when we are playing a particular sport. A person who is aggressive in a particular sport that they play might actually be a good thing. But the same situation, the same type of behavior, when replicated in a different context, might not be so good, right? So what are you defining your strengths through, right? It's contextually focused, and that's where it's, taking leadership opportunities when you need to versus supporting somebody be a leader when you need to, right? These are all contextual. Really important. Our strengths are developmental, meaning that if there's a strength that I want to work on that I might not have at the very moment, that I can develop them. That we're not, some of us have natural born talents for sure, but we also need to work on them and we can develop them. So if we find ourselves in a position of distress and there's a strength or a skill that we need, guess what? We can develop them. And that can be part of our strength. That can be part of the narrative that we share within ourselves. Strength can be adaptable. A person who's a problem solver doesn't necessarily need to problem solve every situation. A person can also accept certain situations, right? So our strengths are not static, they're fluid. And based on the environmental factors, they can be adapted to that. And lastly, environmental factors. Sometimes we have people around us. Sometimes we are put in positions where the environment brings out the best of us. Now, think of how important it is, the story that you're telling yourself, because we can change the environment so that we are in a position of strength. We can have people in our lives that reinforce our strengths. And it is so critical to our well-being that the environment we find ourselves in, we take what we can from it to identify, solidify, and validate the strengths that we have. Because we all have them. So strengths can be defined through all these different parameters, and it can start with yourself and it can end with the environment around you. It's just a matter of that reflection and identification of it. These are just some examples of strengths. And, I think I just literally took it from a website, and this is alphabetical. And I think we're at like L. Think of how many more strengths that we have that's not been identified. But when we're in a distressful situation, when I was trying to merge into the lane and I felt perhaps helpless and angry at the individual, was I able to identify the fact that I held myself back? Was I able to identify to myself that even though I was shaken up, that I was able to calm myself down in a relatively short period of time? Why do I not think about that narrative? Isn't that narrative something that can validate my skills? Isn't that narrative that's something that can make me reflect truly on the fact that I'm still here and talking about it with you guys today? That perhaps is a reflective component that could be considered a strength of mine? But in that moment, if I think that there's something wrong with the individual and that I'm in a situation of deficit and that I'm feeling helpless, that I forget my strength. Again, I can feel upset and that's okay. But what is the story that I tell myself when I feel upset? To give myself a chance to reduce the distress. These are just some examples of our strengths. There are hundreds of strengths that we have. And in fact, sometimes only one of these strengths is needed to identify so much more. I really want to emphasize the strength dialogue. That if we are not confident, that if we don't give ourselves, if we're not compassionate to ourselves, that when we find ourselves in distressing situations, when we find that we're feeling isolated because of COVID-19, when we find that there's challenges of maybe perhaps finding a job, that there's maybe some relationship challenges, what's the conversation that we're having with ourselves? Sometimes the best conversations I have is with myself. And if I'm telling myself great things, if I'm telling myself things that can bring me comfort, then I'm giving myself a chance to deal with the distress that I might be experiencing. Because guess what? Externally, your strength dialogue is relative to what your parents' expectation might be of you, to what your parents' identification stress might be of you, to your partner, to your children, to institutions, to the entire universe. If the entire universe has expectations of you that doesn't take into consideration perhaps your distress, what's your internal dialogue? It is absolutely critical that the you matters more, that the you identifies the strengths that you have, because trust me, we all have strengths, and it is those strengths that's going to help us deal with the distress that we experience. It's just a matter of the conversations that we're having with ourselves. It's really important to identify that. I don't know if you guys heard of the term salience. Tanya, have you heard of the term salience before?
I have not.
Daniel?
For some reason, it makes me think of saline.
Like the thing you take when you go to the hospital or something?
That's all I could think of.
Okay. It could be. I'm not a medical doctor. Maybe there's a connection. But salience is where our attention is at. It's what occupies our attention, right? So the idea is, if our attention in an emotionally distressing situation is on what is not working than what is working, then guess what's the story we're going to share with ourselves? Is that going to be something that's contributing to identifying our strengths, or is that going to be from a place where we are in deficit, right? So salience is where our attention is at. So all of us right here can ask ourselves, Nabeel, what is working over what is not? I have a fantastic beard. That's working really well for me. I happen not to have a great set of hair. That's not working so well for me. If I fixate, I see that, Daniel. If I fixate on what is not working, then perhaps I can't appreciate what is. This is a very simple and a silly example, but it just goes to show that what we pay attention to determines the stories that we tell ourselves. What is right over what is wrong? To Tanya's story, right? She's going perhaps to, take some fitness opportunities, right? And it's what's right about that than what is not, comparing ourselves to perhaps a situation that really we can't fit ourselves into. That is not our context. And emphasizing our strengths in our struggle. When we identify our strengths, It's not to say that when we have strengths, we never struggle. That's not, they're not synonymous, and they're not terms that we use interchangeably or terms that we use completely in separate contexts. We need to know that our strengths, things that we're good at, our resiliency, our adaptability, our creativity, our perseverance, our patience, our ability just to maintain is what we need to address the struggles that we experience in our lives, right? It's all about where our attention is at. Because like I said, the strengths, when we're in distress, does it go away? Do you completely forget the strengths that you have? No, it's just that our attention are not in those spaces. So identifying our strengths is absolutely of critical importance. So very quickly, how do we use our strength to manage our weakness? Number one, acknowledge the emotional experience. Just because I identify that I can persevere does not in any way mean that I cannot be sad. Does not in any way mean that I cannot be angry. But all it means is that my perseverance can help me overcome the sadness that I'm experiencing, can perhaps help me overcome this environmental experience that happens to be upon us. And that leads to emotional intelligence, recognition that the emotional state that we experience is not the same as the reality all around us. It is our experience. So we need to understand that in certain situations, being sad is perfectly okay. That there's nothing, in fact, weak in us at all. In fact, that's the right emotion to have. The identification of strength allows us to be vulnerable when the opportunity, requires that. And one of the activities that I really want to highlight is something that's called the fear jar or the fear box. That's an activity that I've engaged in myself. If you guys have something at home, like a jar that you're not using, all it is you take the jar and you decorate the jar on the outside with the strengths that you have. Perhaps you're creative. Perhaps you're adaptable. Perhaps you pay attention to detail perfectly. You put all the skill sets that you have, the strengths that you have on the outside of your fear jar. And then you identify the fears that you have. So you take a piece of paper, you write down individual fears that you might be having. And you put the fears inside the fear jar. Because guess what? Your strengths are strong enough. They're capable enough to hold your fears, to manage your fears. And when you're ready, perhaps you go into the fear jar and you take a fear out that you're ready to address. But as long as it's in there, the strength is able to support it. I just want to identify and just highlight that the fear jar is a very personal reflection. And so if if there's not a space where you can keep it safe, you really have to identify if it might get into the hands of somebody that you might not want it to get into the hands of. Just be conscious of that. But if you have a place where you can put it, this is a great activity to use our strengths to address our weaknesses. And when we do that, we take ownership over how we choose to respond. Because then being sad is not a bad thing. It's the ability to leverage the strength to respond to the sadness. It's to become aware of the strengths we demonstrate during moments of adversity. In fact, isn't that how strengths are developed to begin with? When we're experiencing adversity, it's the strengths that shine through the most. It's just a matter of us to pay attention to it. And we can become innovative in utilizing our strengths. Like we talked about, the definition of strength is that it's adaptable. So different situations require a different interpretation of our strength, a level of malleability there. And so can I unmute?
Yep.
Can you unmute me? I don't know how to unmute myself. Oh, can you guys hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
I apologize. But again, sometimes we can be, malleable, and sometimes seeking support, being part of this conversation is a great way to identify our strengths to address some of the weaknesses that we might be experiencing. And just to tie it up, this is an activity that all of us can participate in, similar to the fear jar. For example, we identify an adversity that we might be experiencing in life or we have experienced in life. And we want to use how that adversity has made us stronger. So for example, this is my personal example, COVID-19 pandemic. It's definitely an adversity. How have I become stronger as a result of it? I have become, and you know what I like is I am becoming, because it's a fluid process. I cannot simply say I have become. I am becoming more creative. So as some of you guys here might know, I've dabbled in video editing. I've purchased a green screen. For what reason you might add? I wasn't entirely too sure, but it's something that kept me occupied. It gave me a new hobby, and it made me edit videos and be creative in some of the things I share. It is absolutely irrelevant to me in terms of how the content looks. What matters is the process of creation. What matters is that I'm occupying my time, is that I've developed a hobby. And guess what? I might not be perfect at it today, but I might be perfect at it, at a later, or better at it at a later date. So that's made me stronger because it's helped me identify my creativity. And I've done a fear jar. I would have never done a fear jar, but I felt confident enough. I felt creative enough to do one. So think about it for yourself. Identify an adversity that you might be experiencing or that you might have experienced in your life, and think about how that makes you stronger.
Nabeel,
Sorry.
Nabeel, I'm just going to jump in here. I see we only have a few minutes left, and I know I promised to folks who do attend live that if they did have any individual inquiries, we would extend the opportunity for them to do so. So if you are watching this on YouTube and you're interested in participating or maybe speaking with Nabeel, please do join us next Wednesday at 6:30 by following the virtual programs login. However, I'll just ask Nabeel if you want to close the recorded portion of it, and then we can allow, if anyone does want to inquire who's attending, then they can do so.
Absolutely. And again, I apologize, guys, for going a little bit over time. I just want to end with this one quote because I think it's so powerful. Nobody trips over mountains. It's the small pebbles that cause you to stumble. Pass all the pebbles in your path, and you will find that you have crossed the mountain. Sometimes the distress we experience are like mountains, but it's not the mountain that we trip over. It's the small pebbles. So let's deal with the small pebbles with the strengths that we have. And once we do that, perhaps we have crossed the mountains that we experience in our lives. So thank you guys for participating. If there's any questions whatsoever, Daniel, you can stop recording and I'll be happy to answer any questions that we have in the next couple of minutes.